I stood in the back of St. Catherine's Cathedral, watching the most expensive wedding I'd ever seen unfold before my eyes. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow light across marble columns, while a symphony orchestra played softly in the background. The bride, Jennifer Hayes, walked down the aisle in a dress that probably cost more than my car. Every detail screamed of wealth and privilege, from the hand-cut crystal decorations to the imported Italian flowers adorning every pew. But I wasn't there to celebrate. I was there to deliver a gift that would change everything. My name is David Sterling, and 15 years ago, Jennifer's father, Richard Hayes, destroyed my family's life with a handshake and a smile. He was my father's business partner, best friend, and the man we trusted most in the world. That trust nearly killed us, literally and figuratively. I clutched the manila envelope in my jacket pocket, feeling the weight of years of planning and patience. Inside were documents that would turn this fairy tale wedding into Richard Hayes's worst nightmare. The same man who stole my father's construction company and left us homeless was about to learn that some debts can never be forgiven, and some sins demand public reckoning. As Jennifer reached the altar where William Harrison III waited with tears in his eyes, I smiled quietly to myself. The Hayes family had no idea I was here. They thought David Sterling was still the broken teenager who'd disappeared after his father's suicide. But I'd spent 15 years becoming someone else entirely. Someone with the power to destroy them all. Someone with the resources and knowledge to expose their darkest secrets to the world. Growing up, I thought Richard Hayes was like a second father to me. He and my dad, Thomas Sterling, had built Sterling and Hayes Construction from nothing into one of Chicago's most successful companies. They'd met in community college, two hardworking men with big dreams and calloused hands who believed that honest work and fair dealing would lead to prosperity. Uncle Rick, as I called him, would come to our modest house every Sunday for dinner. He'd ruffle my hair, ask about school grades, and tell stories about the early days when he and Dad worked 18-hour shifts just to keep the lights on and pay their workers. His daughter Sarah was my age, and we became inseparable best friends, spending summers at each other's houses and planning our futures together. The company thrived through the early 2000s, specializing in affordable housing projects and taking genuine pride in building homes for working families like ours. Dad would drive me past their latest developments, pointing out architectural details and construction techniques with genuine joy and satisfaction. "We're not just building houses, David," he'd say with conviction. "We're building dreams, creating communities, giving families a place to call home." By 2008, Sterling and Hayes Construction was worth over $20 million. Dad owned 51%, Richard owned 49%. It seemed like the perfect partnership between friends who trusted each other completely, who'd built something meaningful together through decades of shared sacrifice and mutual respect. I was 17 when everything fell apart. The financial crisis hit construction companies hard across the country, but our company had solid contracts and steady income from ongoing projects. We should have survived easily, even thrived while competitors struggled. Instead, within 6 months, we lost everything we'd worked for. The first sign of trouble came when Dad started working even longer hours than usual. He'd leave before dawn and come home after midnight, looking exhausted and worried about something he couldn't quite explain. When I asked what was wrong, he'd just smile tiredly and say business was challenging during the recession, but everything would work out fine. Mom wasn't convinced by his reassurances. I'd hear them talking in hushed, concerned voices after they thought I was asleep. "Something's not right with the company books," she'd whisper urgently. "We're bleeding money somewhere, but Richard keeps saying it's just temporary market fluctuations." Sarah noticed the change in our family dynamics too. Her family had always been wealthier than ours, but suddenly the gap seemed enormous and uncomfortable. They bought a new Mercedes while Dad started driving our old Honda more carefully to save gas money. They renovated their entire kitchen while Mom started clipping coupons and shopping at discount stores. "Is everything okay at your house?" Sarah asked one day after school. We were sitting in her family's massive backyard, the one with the Olympic-sized pool and professional tennis court. "You seem really stressed lately, and your parents look worried all the time." I lied and said everything was fine. I didn't want to admit that my parents were arguing more frequently, that Dad looked physically sick with worry, that I'd overheard Mom calling the bank about missed mortgage payments. The Sterling family had always been proud, hardworking people. We didn't air our problems publicly or ask for help from others. The truth came out on a cold February morning when federal agents knocked on our front door. Dad answered in his bathrobe, confused and frightened as they showed their badges and explained they had a warrant to search our entire house for evidence of financial crimes. Thomas Sterling, you're under investigation for embezzlement and tax fraud, the lead agent announced with professional coldness. We need to examine all financial records related to Sterling and Hayes Construction, including personal computers, file cabinets, and bank statements. I watched from the stairs as they systematically tore through Dad's home office, seizing computers, files, and boxes of documents that represented decades of honest work. Dad kept saying there must be some terrible mistake, that he'd never stolen anything in his entire life. Mom stood in the hallway crying silently, her world crumbling around her. The agents found exactly what they were looking for, evidence that someone had been systematically siphoning money from company accounts for over a year. Forged signatures, fake invoices, money transferred to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. The paper trail led directly to Dad, painted a picture of greed and betrayal that seemed airtight. But I knew my father better than anyone. He was the most honest man I'd ever met, someone who'd return extra change to cashiers and refuse to let employees clock in even a minute early if it wasn't justified. He would never steal, especially not from his own company, not from the workers he considered family. The real thief was someone who had complete access to Dad's signature, who knew the company's banking procedures intimately, who could cover his tracks by blaming his trusting partner. Someone like Richard Hayes, the man we'd called family for 20 years. Dad was arrested 3 days later in front of our house, handcuffed and led away while neighbors watched from their windows. The local news covered it extensively with sensational headlines. Local construction executive charged with embezzling $3.2 million. They used his mugshot, the one where he looked broken and defeated, nothing like the proud businessman I'd known my whole life. Richard Hayes gave a masterful statement to reporters, standing outside the company offices with expensive lawyers flanking him on both sides. "I'm shocked and deeply saddened by these serious allegations," he said, shaking his head with apparent grief. "Thomas Sterling was like a brother to me for 20 years. I trusted him completely with everything, which makes this betrayal even more painful and devastating." It was an Oscar-worthy performance. Uncle Rick played the role of the wounded partner perfectly, expressing disappointment rather than anger, sadness rather than rage. He even mentioned how sorry he felt for Mom and me, how this tragedy had hurt everyone in the community who knew and respected the Sterling family. The truth was far uglier than his public statements suggested. While Dad sat in county jail unable to make the astronomical bail amount, Richard Hayes was busy seizing complete control of Sterling and Hayes Construction. He called an emergency board meeting, had Dad removed as CEO and partner, and renamed the company Hayes Development Group. Within a single week, he'd systematically erased 20 years of my father's work and vision. Sarah tried to reach out during this nightmare, sending text messages saying she was sorry about what happened and hoped we could still be friends despite everything. I deleted them without responding. How could I explain that her father had destroyed mine? How could I maintain a friendship when her family's gain was built on my family's complete destruction? The trial lasted 3 agonizing months and felt like 3 years. Every day, I watched my father sit at the defendant's table, looking smaller and more broken than the day before. The prosecution painted him as a man who'd lived beyond his means, who'd stolen from his own company to fund a lifestyle he couldn't afford on his salary alone. They were completely wrong about his motives, but devastatingly right about the evidence. Someone had been extremely careful to make Dad look guilty beyond any reasonable doubt. Bank statements, forged documents, false testimonies from employees who'd been coached about exactly what to say. The case against Thomas Sterling was airtight and professionally constructed. Richard Hayes testified as the prosecution's star witness, delivering the performance of his lifetime. He talked about noticing irregularities in the company books, about confronting Dad privately before reluctantly going to federal authorities. He even cried on the witness stand when describing how betrayed and devastated he felt. "Thomas was my best friend and closest business partner," he told the jury, dabbing his eyes with tissues provided by prosecutors. "I gave him everything, my trust, my partnership, my friendship, my loyalty. And he stole from me. He stole from our employees. He stole from the families who depended on us for their homes. Dad's court-appointed lawyer was competent, but completely overmatched. We couldn't afford the high-powered legal team that Richard Hayes had hired to systematically destroy us. The evidence was overwhelming, the witnesses convincing, the story believable to 12 jurors who didn't know my father's true character. On November 15, 2009, my father was convicted on 12 counts of embezzlement and fraud. He was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. I watched him led away in shackles, knowing that Richard Hayes had murdered him as surely as if he'd used a gun. We lost everything after the conviction became final. Our house was seized to pay court-ordered restitution, our savings accounts were frozen pending further investigation, and Mom's part-time job at a local pharmacy couldn't cover our most basic expenses. We moved into a one-bedroom apartment in the worst part of town, sharing a bathroom with 3 other struggling families. Dad began serving his sentence at a federal prison in downstate Illinois. Mom and I visited every weekend, making the 3-hour drive in our old Honda that broke down twice before we finally sold it for scrap metal. Watching Dad in his orange jumpsuit, aged 10 years and 10 months, was the most painful thing I'd ever experienced. "I'm sorry," he'd whisper during our visits, tears streaming down his face. "I'm so sorry I couldn't protect you and your mother from this nightmare. I don't understand how this happened to us, how someone could do this." I knew exactly how it happened. Richard Hayes had planned everything perfectly, stealing millions while methodically setting up Dad to take the blame. But proving it seemed impossible with our limited resources. Uncle Rick had covered his tracks too well, destroyed too much evidence, bought too many people's silence with threats and bribes. Meanwhile, the Hayes family thrived and prospered. Sarah posted photos from family vacations to Europe and the Caribbean while we struggled to pay rent. Their construction company landed major government contracts, including several that had originally been awarded to Sterling and Hayes before the scandal broke. Richard Hayes was profiled in Chicago Business Magazine as Businessman of the Year, a resilient entrepreneur who'd rebuilt his company after his partner's devastating betrayal. Mom started getting seriously sick during Dad's 2nd year in prison. She'd always been strong and resilient, but the crushing stress and grinding poverty were wearing her down physically and mentally. She worked 2 exhausting jobs to keep us barely afloat, cleaning office buildings at night and stocking shelves at a grocery store during the day. I took a part-time job at a fast food restaurant to help with basic expenses. One evening, I came home to find Mom collapsed unconscious on our tiny kitchen floor. She'd been hiding her symptoms for weeks: severe chest pains, shortness of breath, extreme fatigue that wouldn't go away. The emergency room doctor said she'd suffered a minor heart attack brought on by chronic stress and physical exhaustion. "She needs complete rest and expensive medication," he explained matter-of-factly. "And she needs to eliminate major stress from her life as much as possible, or the next heart attack could be fatal." But we couldn't afford the prescription medication, and rest was impossible when we were barely surviving paycheck to paycheck. Mom went back to her 2 jobs the following week because we desperately needed every dollar. I watched her struggle and deteriorate, knowing that Richard Hayes' lies were slowly killing the woman who'd raised me. That's when I made a decision that would change everything. I couldn't help Dad from federal prison, and I couldn't cure Mom's broken heart or failing health. But I could start planning something much bigger than anything they could imagine. I began researching Richard Hayes obsessively, treating him like a science project. His business practices, his financial dealings, his personal life, his family relationships, his social connections. I studied him with the intensity of a doctoral thesis, looking for weaknesses and opportunities that could be exploited. Dad died in prison during his 4th year of incarceration. The official cause was listed as heart failure, but I knew the real reason. Thomas Sterling died of a broken heart, destroyed by the ultimate betrayal of his best friend and the loss of everything he'd worked decades to build. Mom and I couldn't afford a proper funeral service. We had a small, depressing ceremony at a generic funeral home, with maybe 20 people in attendance. None of Dad's former employees came to pay respects. None of his old friends bothered to show up. The man who'd once been respected throughout Chicago's construction industry was buried like a pauper, like a stranger. Richard Hayes didn't attend the funeral, of course. but he sent expensive flowers with a card that read, "Sorry for your loss." Thomas was a good man who made some very bad choices. I kept that card, burning every word into my memory. It became fuel for the fire that was building inside me. After the funeral, Mom and I sat in our tiny apartment, grieving and trying to figure out how to move forward. She was sick, tired, and ready to give up on everything. But I was 19 years old with nothing left to lose and everything to prove to the world. "I'm going to destroy him," I told her quietly but with absolute conviction. Mom looked at me with sad, tired eyes. "David, honey, revenge won't bring your father back from the dead. It won't fix anything that's happened to our family." She was wrong about that. Revenge wouldn't bring Dad back, but it might give him the justice he deserved. It might show the world who Richard Hayes really was beneath his respectable facade. And it might prevent him from destroying other innocent families the way he destroyed ours. I disappeared from Chicago 6 months after Dad's funeral. I told Mom I was moving to California to start fresh, to build a new life away from the painful memories and constant reminders of our family's destruction. She understood and even supported the decision. She moved in with her sister in Arizona, finally getting the rest and medical care she desperately needed. But I didn't go to California as planned. Instead, I went to New York City, enrolled in Columbia University under a student loan program for low-income students, and began studying business and finance with obsessive intensity. I changed my appearance dramatically, lost 30 pounds, grew my hair longer, and started wearing glasses. David Sterling became Daniel Parker, at least on all official documents and records. For 4 grueling years, I lived like a monk dedicated to a single purpose. No social life, no romantic relationships, no distractions from my ultimate goal. I studied 18 hours a day, learning everything I could about business, accounting, law, and technology. I graduated summa cum laude with dual degrees in finance and computer science. Then I got my MBA from Wharton, again with perfect grades and crushing debt that I didn't care about. While other students partied and networked for future careers, I spent every free moment researching Richard Hayes and his company with forensic precision. I knew his business practices better than his own accountants, understood his personal life better than his wife, tracked his movements and decisions with scientific accuracy. And I discovered something extremely interesting during my research. Hayes Development Group was successful on the surface, impressive in media coverage, but the foundation was completely rotten. Richard Hayes had been systematically cutting corners, bribing city inspectors, and using substandard materials for years to increase profit margins. He'd been incredibly lucky so far, but luck doesn't last forever in the construction business. After business school, I took a job with Blackstone Capital, one of New York's most aggressive and ruthless investment firms. My official title was Senior Financial Analyst, but my real job was finding vulnerable companies to acquire or destroy through legal manipulation. I was exceptionally good at it, maybe because I understood desperation and weakness so intimately. I spent 2 years learning how predatory capitalism really worked at the highest levels, how to identify fatal weaknesses, exploit financial leverage, and destroy competition through completely legal means. My colleagues thought I was just unusually ambitious and driven, but I was actually learning advanced warfare tactics for a very personal battle that had been 15 years in the making. During this time, I carefully monitored Hayes Development Group from my position in New York. The company had grown significantly, taking on larger projects and expanding into new markets across the Midwest. Richard Hayes was now worth an estimated $40 million, living in a mansion in Lincoln Park with his wife Patricia and their 2 daughters who'd never known hardship. Sarah had graduated from Northwestern University with a marketing degree and joined the family business as Director of Public Relations. Her younger sister Jennifer was engaged to William Harrison III, a lawyer from one of Chicago's most prominent legal families. The Hayes family had become Chicago society royalty, appearing at charity galas and political fundraising events. They'd built their entire success on my father's grave, using the company he'd helped create to fund their lavish lifestyle and social prominence. But I'd learned enough about their operations to know they were extremely vulnerable to the right kind of pressure. Hayes Development Group carried massive debt, relied on questionable business practices, and had several major projects that were potential disasters waiting to happen. My opportunity came when Jennifer Hayes announced her engagement to William Harrison III, heir to Harrison, Caldwell and Associates law firm. The wedding was scheduled for June 15th at St. Catherine's Cathedral, with a reception at the Palmer House Hilton. Chicago Magazine called it the social event of the season, with guest lists that read like a who's who of the city's power elite. I'd been tracking the Hayes family's social calendar for months, waiting for the perfect public moment to strike. A wedding meant extensive media attention, hundreds of important guests, and maximum potential for public embarrassment. It also meant Richard Hayes would be at his most vulnerable, proud, distracted, and surrounded by the social elite he'd worked so hard to impress over the years. 3 months before the wedding, I made my move with surgical precision. I liquidated all my investments, cashed out my 401k retirement account, and borrowed against everything I owned. I raised $2.8 million, enough money to execute the comprehensive plan I'd been developing for over a decade. I hired a team of the best private investigators, forensic accountants, and retired FBI agents that money could buy. Their job was simple but crucial: find absolute proof that Richard Hayes had systematically framed my father. I gave them unlimited resources and one clear instruction: get me evidence that would hold up in any court of law. What they found exceeded my wildest expectations and vindicated every suspicion I'd harbored for 15 years. Hayes hadn't just stolen from Sterling and Hayes Construction. He'd been running sophisticated illegal operations for over a decade. Bribery, tax evasion, money laundering, construction fraud, witness intimidation. The man was a career criminal who'd gotten rich by destroying honest people like my father. Better yet, they found the smoking gun I'd dreamed about: recorded phone conversations where Hayes discussed framing Dad with his lawyer and accountant. The conversations were detailed, incriminating, and absolutely devastating to his carefully constructed public image. I spent weeks planning every detail of my appearance at Jennifer's wedding with military precision. I needed to look successful but not threatening, confident but not arrogant, respectable but not memorable. I bought an expensive Armani suit, got a professional haircut at the city's best salon, and practiced my presentation until every word was perfect. The hardest part was getting a legitimate invitation to the exclusive event. The Hayes family obviously hadn't included David Sterling on their guest list, but Daniel Parker was a different story entirely. I'd built a solid reputation in New York finance circles, appeared in several business publications, and maintained careful connections with Chicago's investment community. I called Patricia Hayes directly, introducing myself as a family friend of the groom who'd like to attend the ceremony. I mentioned my work with Blackstone Capital and suggested a potential business partnership with Hayes Development Group that could be worth millions. She was charmed by my politeness and thoroughly impressed by my credentials. "Of course you're welcome to join us for Jennifer's special day," she said warmly over the phone. "Any friend of the Harrison family is certainly a friend of ours. We'll make sure you have a seat at one of the better tables." The week before the wedding, I flew to Chicago and checked into the Four Seasons under my assumed identity. I spent 3 days conducting final surveillance, confirming last-minute details, and preparing all my materials with obsessive care. Everything had to be absolutely perfect. I would only get one chance to destroy Richard Hayes publicly, and I couldn't afford any mistakes. On Friday, June 14th, I received final confirmation from my investigation team. They'd gathered enough concrete evidence to destroy Richard Hayes completely and permanently. Criminal charges, civil lawsuits, federal investigations. His entire empire would collapse within months of exposure. But I wanted more than just legal justice. I wanted public spectacle, social humiliation, and personal devastation. Saturday morning arrived sunny and perfect, exactly the kind of weather that Chicago society weddings dream about. I put on my most expensive suit, a charcoal gray Armani that had cost more than my family's monthly rent in the desperate days after Dad's arrest. I looked in the bathroom mirror and saw a successful businessman, not the broken teenager who'd fled Chicago 10 years earlier. I arrived at St. Catherine's Cathedral an hour early, walking through the ornate doors like I belonged among Chicago's elite. The wedding party was still preparing for the ceremony, so I took a seat in the back row and watched the elaborate preparations unfold with fascination. Professional florists arranged massive bouquets, musicians tuned expensive instruments, and photographers captured every detail of what would be Jennifer's perfect day. I recognized several faces from my extensive research into Chicago's power structure. City councilmen, prominent lawyers, construction executives, real estate moguls, the same social elite who'd abandoned my father when he needed support most. They were all here to celebrate Richard Hayes's family, to show their respect for Chicago's supposed self-made success story. None of them knew the real story behind Hayes Development Group. None of them knew how the company had actually been built on stolen money and destroyed lives. But they were about to find out in the most public way possible. At exactly 2 p.m., the ceremony began with traditional wedding music. Jennifer looked absolutely beautiful in her wedding dress, radiant with happiness and completely unaware that her perfect day was about to become a public nightmare. William Harrison III stood at the altar looking proud and nervous, exactly like any groom should on his wedding day. And Richard Hayes walked his daughter down the aisle with tears in his eyes, playing the role of loving father one last time before his carefully constructed world collapsed around him. I waited until the ceremony concluded and guests began moving toward the reception hall for cocktails and dinner. This was my moment, the time when people were relaxed, celebrating, and most vulnerable to shocking surprises. I approached Richard Hayes during the cocktail hour, while he was graciously accepting congratulations from other prominent guests. "Mr. Hayes," I said smoothly, extending my hand with a confident smile. "Daniel Parker from Blackstone Capital. Congratulations on your daughter's beautiful wedding." He shook my hand warmly, clearly not recognizing me despite our family resemblance. 15 years had changed my appearance significantly, and he probably assumed David Sterling was still living in poverty somewhere, broken by his family's destruction. "Thank you so much for coming," he replied with genuine warmth. "Are you a friend of the Harrison family?" "Actually, I'm here because of you and your impressive company," I said, maintaining steady eye contact. "I've been following Hayes Development Group for some time now. Very impressive what you've built from the ashes of that unfortunate partnership situation." His chest puffed with obvious pride at the compliment. "Well, it certainly hasn't been easy. Lots of hard work and personal sacrifice. Some very tough decisions along the way, but that's business." "I imagine so. Especially after what happened with your former partner. Thomas Sterling, wasn't it?" I watched his expression change slightly. Still friendly and social, but more cautious now, more alert to potential danger. "Yes, that was extremely unfortunate," he said carefully. "Thomas made some very poor choices that hurt a lot of innocent people." "Indeed he did," I agreed with false sympathy. "In fact, that's exactly why I'm here tonight." I reached into my jacket and pulled out the thick manila envelope that contained 15 years of planning and investigation. "I have something I think you'll find very interesting, Mr. Hayes." Richard Hayes's face went completely pale as he opened the envelope and saw the first document. It was a bank statement from a Cayman Islands account, showing deposits that matched exactly the money stolen from Sterling and Hayes Construction. His name was clearly printed on the account as the sole beneficiary. "What is this?" he whispered, looking around desperately to make sure no other guests could see what we were discussing. "Evidence of your crimes," I said with calm satisfaction. 10 years' worth of financial records, recorded conversations, witness statements, and forensic accounting analysis. Everything you did to frame my father and destroy my family." He looked up at me with growing recognition and absolute terror. The blood drained from his face as the truth hit him. David Sterling. "Hello, Uncle Rick." The color drained completely from his face as the full implications became clear. His hands shook uncontrollably as he flipped through more documents. Photographs of him meeting with corrupt city inspectors, transcripts of phone calls discussing illegal activities, bank records showing systematic money laundering operations. "This is impossible," he stammered, his voice barely audible. "Where did you get all this information?" "I've been working on it for 10 years, I replied with ice-cold calm. "Ever since you murdered my father in that federal prison." "I didn't murder anyone. Thomas died of natural causes." "Thomas Sterling died in prison for crimes you committed," I said, my voice remaining steady but my eyes burning with 15 years of accumulated rage. "He died believing his best friend had betrayed him. He died thinking he'd failed his family. You destroyed an innocent man to cover your own sins." Richard Hayes looked around desperately, realizing that we were standing in the middle of his daughter's wedding reception with Chicago's social elite watching from nearby tables. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice barely above a desperate whisper. I smiled for the first time in our conversation, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. "I want everyone to know the truth about who you really are." He grabbed my arm desperately, his grip shaking with fear. "Please, David. Not here. Not at Jennifer's wedding. She's completely innocent in all this." "So was I when you destroyed my family," I replied, gently removing his hand from my arm. "So was my mother when your lies gave her a heart attack. So was my father when he died in a prison cell for your crimes." "I'll make it right," he pleaded desperately. "I'll give you money, lots of money. I'll confess privately to authorities. I'll turn myself in after the wedding. Just please don't ruin Jennifer's special day." It was tempting for just a moment. But then I remembered Dad's pathetic funeral, the tiny service where no one came because everyone thought he was a criminal. I remembered Mom working herself to death because we couldn't afford proper medical care. I remembered the years of poverty and shame while the Hayes family lived in luxury built on my father's reputation. "You should have thought about innocent people before you started destroying them," I said with finality. I walked toward the microphone at the front of the reception hall. The band had just finished playing, and guests were settling in for dinner service. The timing was absolutely perfect for maximum impact. "Excuse me," I announced, tapping the microphone to get everyone's attention. "Could I have everyone's attention for just a moment?" The reception hall grew quiet as 300 prominent guests turned their attention toward me with curiosity. I saw Jennifer and William at the head table, looking confused about who this stranger was interrupting their celebration. I saw Patricia Hayes sitting frozen with growing terror, somehow sensing that disaster was about to strike their family. And I saw Richard Hayes pushing desperately through the crowd, trying frantically to reach me before I could speak the words that would destroy everything he'd built. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice carrying clearly through the professional sound system. "I apologize for interrupting this beautiful celebration, but I have something extremely important to share with all of you." "Security," Richard Hayes shouted from across the room. "Get him away from there immediately." But the security guards hesitated, unsure whether I was a legitimate guest or a dangerous intruder. I dressed impeccably, spoken politely, and acted like I belonged among Chicago's elite. They didn't want to risk embarrassing the Hayes family by forcibly removing someone who might be an important business associate. "My name is David Sterling," I continued, ignoring the growing commotion. "Some of you might remember that name from 15 years ago. My father was Thomas Sterling, former partner in Sterling and Hayes Construction." A murmur went through the crowd as several people obviously remembered the scandal that had rocked Chicago's construction industry. My father was convicted of embezzling from his own company and died in federal prison. Everyone believed he was guilty, including me for many years. But recently, I discovered something that changes everything we thought we knew. I held up the manila envelope for everyone to see. "I have absolute proof that Thomas Sterling was completely innocent. I have irrefutable proof that Richard Hayes framed his best friend to cover his own extensive crimes." The murmur became a roar as guests began talking urgently among themselves. Jennifer stood up at the head table, her face pale with shock and growing confusion about what was happening to her perfect wedding day. 10 years ago," I continued, my voice cutting through the noise, "Richard Hayes systematically stole $3.2 million from Sterling and Hayes Construction. When he realized federal investigators were getting close to discovering his crimes, he planted evidence to frame my father for everything." Richard Hayes reached the front of the room and tried to grab the microphone from my hands. "This is completely insane," he shouted desperately. "He's lying. Thomas Sterling was guilty of everything." I stepped back, maintaining control of the microphone and the crowd's attention. "I have bank statements from offshore accounts in your name. I have recorded phone conversations where you discuss framing my father with your lawyer. I have sworn witness testimony from 3 former employees who helped you forge documents." The crowd was in complete chaos now. Some people were standing up to get a better view of the confrontation. Others were whispering urgently to their dinner companions. The professional photographers had stopped taking pictures of the bride and groom and were now focused entirely on the drama unfolding at the microphone. "This is Jennifer's wedding day," Patricia Hayes screamed from her table, her voice breaking with emotion. "How dare you ruin our daughter's special day with these lies?" I looked directly at her with years of accumulated pain and anger. "Your daughter's special day was paid for with blood money, Mrs. Hayes. This entire family fortune was built on my father's grave. Jennifer was crying now, her perfect wedding makeup streaming down her face as tears ruined hours of professional preparation. William Harrison was trying desperately to comfort her, while his parents looked absolutely horrified by the scandal that was engulfing their family celebration. "I'm calling the police right now," Richard Hayes announced, pulling out his phone with shaking hands. "Please do," I replied with complete confidence. "I've already sent copies of all this evidence to the FBI, the IRS, and the Chicago Tribune. By Monday morning, everyone will know exactly what kind of man you really are." The reception hall erupted into complete chaos. Guests were standing, talking loudly, some heading for the exits in embarrassment. The wedding photographer was capturing everything, and I could see several people recording video with their phones. This scandal would be all over social media within hours, shared and reshared by everyone who witnessed it. Richard Hayes made one final, desperate attempt to control the narrative. "He's mentally ill," he shouted to the crowd, his voice cracking with panic. "David Sterling has been obsessed with my family for years. He's been stalking us, harassing us, making up these ridiculous allegations because he can't accept the truth." I opened the envelope and pulled out a specific document, the smoking gun I'd been saving for this exact moment. This is a recorded phone conversation from March 15, 2009. Richard Hayes speaking to his accountant about transferring stolen money to offshore accounts. I pressed play on a small digital recording device. Richard Hayes's voice filled the reception hall through the sound system, clear and unmistakable. "Make sure the deposits can't be traced back to the construction accounts. And double-check that all the forged signatures look authentic. Thomas is going to take the fall for this entire operation, so the evidence has to be absolutely perfect." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard Hayes's face went completely white as he heard his own voice confessing to crimes he'd spent 15 years denying. Every person in that room could tell it was definitely him speaking. "That's not me," he whispered weakly, but his voice carried no conviction whatsoever. Everyone in the room could tell it was absolutely him. Jennifer collapsed into her chair, sobbing uncontrollably as her perfect wedding day became a public nightmare. Her family had been exposed as criminals in front of Chicago's social elite, and her new marriage was already tainted by scandal. William Harrison looked like he was seriously considering whether to stay married to the daughter of a man who would soon be arrested. The police arrived 20 minutes later, but not to arrest me as Richard Hayes had desperately hoped. I'd made sure to coordinate my timing perfectly with law enforcement. Earlier that morning, federal agents had received copies of all my evidence along with sworn statements from key witnesses. By the time I stood up at the wedding reception, arrest warrants were already being prepared. "Richard Hayes," Detective Sarah Hopkins announced as she entered the reception hall with two other officers. "You're under arrest for embezzlement, fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit perjury." The room watched in stunned silence as she read him his rights and handcuffed him in his expensive tuxedo. Richard Hayes, the respected businessman and loving father, was led away from his daughter's wedding in handcuffs while 300 guests watched in complete horror. Patricia Hayes was screaming and crying, begging the police to stop, insisting there had been some terrible mistake. But the evidence was absolutely overwhelming. Her husband had been living an elaborate lie for 15 years, and now the truth was finally being revealed to the world. Jennifer's wedding dress was ruined. "I'm sorry about your wedding," I told her as I prepared to leave. "But your father destroyed my family. He killed my father and nearly killed my mother. He deserved to face justice, even if it meant ruining your special day." She looked at me with a mixture of hatred and grief, her voice breaking. "I never did anything to you," she whispered through her tears. "Neither did I to your family," I replied quietly. "But sometimes innocent people get hurt when the truth finally comes out." The Chicago Tribune ran the story on Sunday morning with the headline, "Prominent developer arrested at daughter's wedding for framing former partner." The article included detailed information about the evidence I'd gathered, the federal investigation that had been launched, and the overwhelming likelihood that Richard Hayes would spend the rest of his life in prison. The story went viral on social media within hours. Video clips from the wedding reception were shared millions of times across platforms, with people commenting on the dramatic confrontation and the shocking revelation of Hayes's crimes. Hashtag Justice for Thomas Sterling began trending as people learned about my father's story and Hayes' systematic destruction of our family. Within 48 hours, Hayes Development Group collapsed completely and permanently. Their bank accounts were frozen by federal authorities, their assets were seized pending investigation, and their construction projects were shut down by city officials. The company that had been built on stolen money and destroyed lives vanished almost overnight. Patricia Hayes filed for divorce immediately, claiming through her lawyer that she'd known absolutely nothing about her husband's extensive criminal activities. She tried desperately to protect their personal assets, but most of their wealth was already being claimed by Richard's victims and the federal government. Sarah Hayes, my former best friend, lost her job when the company collapsed entirely. She'd been completely innocent of her father's crimes, but she was still a casualty of his downfall and public exposure. The last I heard, she was working as a waitress in a different state while trying to rebuild her shattered life. Jennifer's marriage to William Harrison III was annulled within a month of the wedding disaster. His prominent family couldn't risk being publicly associated with the Hayes scandal, and the stress had destroyed any love between the young couple before it could develop. The entire Hayes empire, built on my father's blood and reputation, had crumbled in a matter of days. Richard Hayes' trial began 8 months later, and I testified as the prosecution's star witness. I told the jury about my father's innocence and Hayes' systematic frame-up, presenting evidence that was so overwhelming it left no room for reasonable doubt. Bank records, recorded conversations, witness testimony, and forensic analysis proved conclusively what had really happened 15 years earlier. Hayes' expensive defense team tried desperately to portray me as a vengeful son seeking retribution rather than justice, but the facts spoke for themselves with devastating clarity. Their client had stolen millions of dollars, destroyed an innocent man, and built his fortune on lies and betrayal. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Richard Hayes was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole. At age 62, he would likely die in the same prison system where my father had died. Thomas Sterling was a good man who died for crimes he didn't commit. I said in my victim impact statement to the court. Richard Hayes destroyed my family to cover his own sins. Today, justice has finally been served. After the sentencing, I visited my father's grave for the first time since his funeral. I placed a copy of the newspaper coverage on his headstone and told him that his name had been cleared completely. "Everyone knows the truth now, Dad," I whispered. "Everyone knows you were innocent." The civil lawsuits took another 2 years to resolve completely, but eventually I recovered most of the money Richard Hayes had stolen from Sterling and Hayes Construction. After legal fees and taxes, I received about $8 million, enough to live comfortably for the rest of my life. I used part of the money to establish the Thomas Sterling Foundation, which provides legal assistance to small business owners who've been victimized by corporate crime. We've helped dozens of families avoid the fate that befell mine, providing resources and expertise to fight back against powerful criminals. I also bought back my childhood home, the one we'd lost when Dad was arrested. It felt good to sit in the kitchen where we'd once eaten Sunday dinners with Uncle Rick, back when we thought he was family. But the sweetest revenge wasn't the money or the legal victories. It was watching Richard Hayes' carefully constructed world collapse exactly the way mine had 15 years earlier. He lost his freedom, his wealth, his reputation, and his family. He experienced the same helplessness and humiliation that my father had endured. The difference was that Richard Hayes deserved everything that happened to him. My mother moved back to Chicago and finally got the medical care she needed. Her health improved dramatically once the stress of poverty and shame was lifted from her shoulders. She lived to see her husband's name cleared and his killer brought to justice. "Your father would be proud," she told me after the trial ended. "You never gave up on him." Today, I run a successful investment firm that specializes in helping small businesses grow and prosper. I learned valuable lessons from my family's destruction, about trust, about power, and about the importance of fighting for justice even when the odds seem impossible. I never saw Sarah Hayes again after her father's arrest, though I heard she eventually moved to another state and changed her name entirely. Jennifer Hayes disappeared from public view completely after her marriage was annulled. The family that had once ruled Chicago society simply vanished, their legacy reduced to a cautionary tale about greed and betrayal. Sometimes people ask if I feel guilty about ruining Jennifer's wedding, about destroying an innocent woman's special day to get revenge on her father. The answer is complicated. I'm sorry that innocent people got hurt, but I'm not sorry for exposing the truth. Richard Hayes had 15 years to confess his crimes, to clear my father's name, to show some basic human decency. Instead, he built a fortune on stolen money while my family suffered in poverty and shame. He chose his path, and I chose mine. The gift I brought to Jennifer's wedding wasn't wrapped in pretty paper or tied with a bow. It was justice, served cold after 15 years of patience and planning. It was the truth about who her father really was and what he'd done to innocent people. Some gifts are meant to be forgotten quickly. Others are meant to change everything forever. Mine was the kind that reveals character, destroys illusions, and ensures that justice finally prevails.
If this story got you thinking, go ahead and hit that like button. Don't forget to subscribe for more real stories that hit deep, and tap the bell so you don't miss what's coming next. And hey, if you know someone who needs to hear this one, share it with them. Thanks for watching.